Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. I want to do corsets again. I'm so over the whole winter fashion stuff. Like, it's time for me to do more summery stuff. And my most favorite thing to sew, apart from coats, which obviously is more in the winter season, are corsets. So I'm not going to do any traditional stays or corsetry or whatever historically accurate because I'm simply not educated enough on that. But I want to do some sort of modern interpretation of like these 1700 stays that you might know, with the tabs down here at the waist hip area, which I already prepared here in my mock-up. And then I'm gonna just have a little bit of fun with decorating the whole thing. I'm thinking about doing a souttage. Is that what it's called? These very ornament embroideries of some, you know, bands or like some rope or whatever onto the corset, and I'm super excited to get started. I already prepared somewhat my corset patterns, so I'm gonna do them in this lovely lilac color. I just used some very thick denim, or this is canvas actually, as a backing and just basted it onto my fashion fabric, which has interfacing on. I am going to use some, not just some, a lot of boning, because I want to have structure and I want to have like lines all throughout my corset. So I will be using some stitchable boning. I'm using Rigiline for that. Also, sorry if I sound very nosy. My nose is very much stuck, so sorry about that. Hopefully next week I don't have to deal with that problem anymore, but you know, as I said before, I already did a mock-up. This is what it looks like. It fits really, really well. I did some alterations that I also filmed, so I can also put in some footage of that. Obviously the zipper is just for fitting purposes. I'm actually going to use a 30cm long straight busk for the front closure, and then here in the back I'm going to have a lace up so that I can, you know, cinch me in, and then from then on I can use the busk to get in and out. And I have the tabs down here, which first time ever doing that, and they honestly worked out pretty nicely. Everything else will obviously be boned. I changed the seams because I didn't like this kind of pattern here, so I made them go straight up to the neckline. And apart from that, I did some tryouts because, you know, in traditional stays they have, you know, obviously the whalebone to make it stiff, but then they also like use some sort of, what is that, like some sort of thicker thread, whatever, that they sewed into the piece to create these very like big areas of very intricate 3D-ish lines. So I wanted to recreate that, and I did some experiments for that, and honestly I think I failed. So let me just show you that. So that's my first tryout. I also went ahead and tried out to insert the busk. That was super easy, no big deal. But then right here is what I was talking about. So I used some thicker material for that. So I used this and just inserted it into my, like in between two layers of my fashion fabric. That was a pain to do these 4 lines, and they don't really look good and they're not sturdy. So I changed it right here to stitchable boning, which obviously is going to make it stable, but it doesn't have this 3D effect that I really like. But since I, you know, use some canvas and it is, you know, a tiny bit thicker, if I tighten my tension of the thread while top stitching here, it might get a little bit of 3D effects like right here. So I'm eyeing more towards this. And then I also did something very crazy. I thought that maybe if I, you know, have some very thin material on the inside, it's easier for me to use my zipper foot to, you know, get the lines down. But this is what it looks like on the fashion fabric side, and you can honestly not see the 3D effect at all, so that was out of the picture. And then my last attempt was to use some piping right here, because it already has that thread on the inside, and you can just top stitch it onto your fashion fabric, and you can top stitch it pretty tightly with your zipper foot. So that's what that looked like. But honestly, it was super frustrating because the fabric just, you know, was doing whatever it wanted. As you can see, like the wrinkles right here, it wouldn't lay flat. So I don't think that I'm gonna do that either. So the only possibility that I have basically is to use, you know, straight up boning and top stitch it in whatever manner that I like. And then you're gonna have hopefully a tiny bit of this 3D effect, but you're obviously gonna have a boning effect. So that's probably what I will be going for. And this down here is not what I will be doing. This makes no sense. It needs to be straight down. Yeah, but that's basically it. So what I will be doing is put the corset together and then put the boning in so that I can see where the lines are, what looks good and so on. And you just have a better picture on like the whole design itself. So yeah. Let's get started with that. So I have my front piece in front of me with my busk already placed, and I want to have my, like the knobs right here, I want to have it on my left side, so this right here, so that I can close it how I usually close my garments, so that, you know, you can put your hand in from the left side. That's usually the women's closure that you also find in stores and whatnot for coats and stuff. It's always that side. In order to put this side in, I don't really just want to cut into my fabric because it's gonna fray. So I'm thinking about actually doing some buttonholes right here where these are and have them hide on the inside, because obviously I'm gonna line this piece. Down here I'll have to hand sew that, but you know, that's fine. So I'm just gonna go ahead and mark a few things first and foremost. So I'm gonna mark my 1 centimeter line, which is where my seam allowance stops. And I'm gonna do that on top here as well, because this up here needs to sit right where the seam allowance stops. I'm just gonna draw around my busk, and then I'm gonna, you know, draw right and left these metal closure thingies so that I know how big my buttonhole needs to be and where it needs to sit. This side right here is easier. You're gonna mark the same thing, and then with an awl you're gonna, you know, pinch the fabric and create a hole by pushing the fibers to the side, and then you can just put this through without having any issues of fraying, because you didn't actually cut the threads or the fibers, you actually just pushed them to the side. Okay, with the buttonholes it actually worked out really well. I added a facing, basically is what this is, to the side, so I can put some strength on this front piece, so when I have everything in place I can go ahead and top stitch right next to the busk, and then I'm just gonna, you know, cut it somewhere, probably like here, and have that as a facing. And I'm gonna stitch all around the busk, so I'm gonna have like here this rounded corner and then down here as well, and keep it securely in place. Okay, I guess the busk is done. This is what it looks like from the inside. Obviously I'm gonna cut the facing down so that it is not randomly stopping on the front piece, but that is what it looks like. It goes together really easily. I think it looks also really pretty. So with that done, I can continue putting in boning on the front piece. Because I have, you know, the bust pieces right here, it's gonna get curvy once these are attached right here, because, you know, that's the bust area. And I don't think it's easy to put boning in after the fact, so I think I'm gonna put it in this area right now, and then I'm gonna continue putting the bust pieces in and the side piece and so on. So I will draw lines onto my front side where I want to have my top stitches, and then actually I'm gonna have my Rigiline boning on the underside, so where I'm not actually seeing it, but I can, you know, make it look straight and stuff like that. And I'm gonna top stitch from the right side face, with the right side facing up, because the top stitches always look better than the bobbin stitches, I guess. So I want to have that on the upper, on the actual side, that it will be visible. So I'm thinking doing vertical ones here, but also curved ones right here. The curved ones need to be added once the cup is in. So and I'm not gonna do like everything with boning, I'm also just gonna do some decorative top stitches. I think I'm just gonna draw some lines and then see where I go from there, because I don't really know if I should add the bust pattern or if I should do the boning first. So I'm just gonna draw in my 1 centimeter stitching line right here and here. Maybe something like that would look good. But then I have to add the bust piece in order to be able to sew these ones. Maybe like that. I don't know. I'm gonna put this seam together here. I'm gonna put right sides of the bust piece and the front piece together, iron everything open, and then, you know, do the stitches. So this is what it looks like now. As you can see, the markings are pretty nice. They all like look now straight, even though they are round, but from the front it looks straight because you have a rounded area right here. So I have to iron this, which means all of my drawn lines will be erased, but we're just gonna redraw them. So I'm gonna use a tailor's ham and iron the whole thing open. Okay. So you can kind of still see the lines. I don't think that I need to redraw them, but I am going to do one without, one with, so that I am not using too much boning, as obviously this doesn't need boning after boning, like it's gonna be fine. But I'm probably gonna use boning around the front area here. Probably this one will be with boning. So yeah, let's get to top stitching. This is what it looks like now. I went ahead and also did the other side, so now my front pieces are done. As you can see right here, I actually added an embroidery. This is a freehand embroidery that I did, and I'm gonna mirror the same design to the other side, but let me just tell you how I got here, basically. So I actually planned to do a suitage with this piece, which is basically where you stitch on a piece of suitage, you know, some sort of thicker thread, and you create these patterns with that. And I did not have a thread that was, you know, thick enough and nice enough to put on here. So I tried out some satin stitches with my sewing machine. I felt like you didn't have the best control because it matters how the piece is oriented for the stitch. So you have to like constantly, you know, and smoothly turn the piece so that the satin stitch actually follows the curve, which is super inconvenient with a thick metal thing here in the center. It's just gonna bump onto the machine all the time. So then I went ahead and tried some freehand embroidery on my machine with a very, very small satin, narrow satin stitch, which looked like this. And I felt like that was not neat at all. Like, this looks messy. I also did a straight stitch, same thing, it just looks messy. So that was out of the picture as well. Then I scrolled through my stitch options on my machine and I came across a chapter called Antique Stitches, which I thought, perfect. I'm gonna do some sort of antique stitching. And I used this one right here, and then a satin stitch for the circles down here. And that is what I ended up doing. So for this side, obviously I was super, super careful. I was doing one stitch, turning the piece, doing the next stitch, counting, because it always does 4 back and forth, and then it goes to the next one. So this takes a while, but I think it looks really, really nice, and it's gonna look really cool on this piece, also on this side here. Obviously, I used some backing. This is just some tearaway backing that I use mainly for my embroideries, but for when your fabric is not one piece of fabric, but it has like all of these bumps and, you know, boning, it just sewed over top of that. If you have a backing, it's so much easier. The machine just does its thing. You don't really have to check if anything bunches up or if, you know, the transporter works. So I'm gonna use some tearaway backing for this side as well. and super carefully also stitch along my design right here, which I just freehanded. I mean, I guess I can also put it onto the pattern and then you can also sew this design. And this is really cool because you don't necessarily have to have an embroidery machine. This is just, you know, a normal straight stitch just 4 times. So if you have any options for a stitch that, you know, looks thicker because you just stitch over it a couple of times, then use that one. But as I did, just try out a bunch of things and then you'll end up with something you like. That is always my get-go. So let's get started on the other side. Okay, and that is the embroidery finished. I think it looks really cute. Maybe if I feel like it, I'm gonna add more to the other parts. I don't know about that yet, but you know, this is a super easy, I mean, it takes some time, I guess, and there is a learning curve to it, but it is actually pretty easy to make these. So just go stitch by stitch and then you should end up with a really nice embroidery like this. I also used metallic thread, so I would suggest you use a needle that is for metallic thread. I can recommend you the gold top stitch needle from Schmidt's, which is really nice for metallic threads because the eye is just bigger so it doesn't tear as easily. But other than that, I think the front piece is now done and we can continue basically putting all of the pieces onto the corset now so that we finally have like a whole thing, not just, you know, 2 of these panels that just look funny. So let's continue with the side piece. So the side front piece looks so funny because I put the waist dart into that diagonal dividing seam. That's why, you know, obviously you can see the dart right here, but that is why this looks so funny. And it's gonna go more to a straight like dividing seam in the back, but right here I felt like the V would also complement the figure really nicely. And in like the 1700s stays that I was researching, they all had this kind of design to it. So I really fell in love with that and I wanted to do that as well. The only thing that we need to do for this seam is match up the notch to the seam right here. And, you know, obviously the top and the bottom, and then that's done. So I went ahead and finished, or like more or less finished, the front and side front pieces. I also added an embroidery onto the seam itself. I think this looks really nice. It complements the embroidery here in the front. So I'm gonna go and do some more embroidery probably throughout the whole piece. I was thinking about doing some here at the tabs or maybe up here as well. I'm not sure about that. I have to finish the whole thing before doing that. But basically what we're gonna continue now is just put the different panels onto the seams here. So we're gonna start with the side, which is this right here. And I'm just gonna put right sides of my side and my side front together and match up the notch, which is right here, and that is until where I will be sewing, and then this matches up as well. I'm gonna iron the seam allowance open here, and then I'm just gonna continue putting all of the panels onto my bodice and adding the boning to it. I'm gonna continue with my side back, then the middle back, and then finally the back piece to create a full corset. And right here at the notch, I actually cut towards the stitching line so that I'm able to iron the seam open, like so. And right here, I cut into the seam. Obviously, for the tabs, we are gonna cut away the seam allowance. But before I'm doing that, I'm gonna sew right next to that so that nothing frays. So I'm just gonna leave it like that for now and continue putting all of the panels on. I finished putting all of the panels onto my piece, and I'll continue with adding a boning to every seam, and I'm gonna use a 1 centimeter thick Ridgeline boning for that. This one right here. which I'm just gonna have in the center of my seams, obviously on this side. And I'm gonna stitch right and left of it to have these seams like fixed and sturdy. And once I'm done with that, I'm gonna go parallel to the seam that lays more towards the front. So for this panel, for example, I'm gonna go parallel to this seam right here and do these stitchings as I did here, all the way down into the tab, as I already started here because I sewed this stitching line already. And I'm gonna add the boning to all of these seams like every other, and yeah, have everything super sturdy. And since I have seams left and right of each seam, I stop right where the stitching starts. So you can see it right here. I always stopped like right there where the stitching was to create edges. And I'm gonna use my embroidery machine to add these cute little details which resemble flossings. Obviously it's not, is it? I guess it is, but these are done by machine. And yeah, I think they look really cute, and I'll experiment a bit with this stitching right here as well. I think I added it, this is my already prepared left side of the corset. Yeah, I added it to the second seam in the back, so I'll be doing that here as well in this seam right here. I'm gonna go and add the boning to each seam, do stitches right and left of the seam, and then always orientate myself at the further to the front laying panel to create the parallel stitches. And yeah, I'm gonna do that all the way down into the tabs to make them sturdy as well, since I will be adding ridgeline boning throughout the whole piece. I'm not gonna do anything to the center back piece yet, apart from the stitching line right here, because we're gonna have grommets right here, and obviously you don't need the stitches there. So just do the stitching here at the seam and then, you know, stop, and we'll continue on with the grommets before anything else. Okay, I finished the other side as far as I was describing before. So I added the flossing, I added the decorative stitching, and of course I added all of the seams and bonings on the inside. And now we're going to tackle the center back panel because we have to add the grommets there. But before we do that, let's just draw on a little bit of a guideline so that we know where we can continue the decorative stitching. So I'm going to draw in my center back seam. So I'm going to measure 1 centimeter away from my raw edge, as that is my seam allowance. And you're gonna find the notch for the tab also in your center back. So that is until where the grommets will go. And from my center back line that I just drew in, I'm gonna measure 2 centimeters into the piece. That will be the space where I place the grommets. And yes, the back panel, the center back is not straight, it is actually curved because it follows the shape of your back, and your back is just, you know, it's not straight. I'm also gonna draw in my stitching line up here and down here. And I'll be stitching around that rectangle that I just drew in because that's gonna be the start point for, you know, the stitches down here, and then also the stitches parallel to this seam right here. So we need somewhere to end or begin the stitches in this case. So let's go from here around here all the way up, and then continue the boning channels or like seams all the way down here and finish them up. Now with that done, I'm actually going to do a facing. So this doesn't have to be like a pattern piece or whatever. It just needs to be a rectangle that is, you know, big enough to cover the grommet placket and long enough to cover it as well. So I'm just gonna go into my stash and take out anything that fits the criteria without like cutting it to any specific shape. I'm gonna sew from the notch down here all the way up to the neckline, and I'm gonna understitch this, and that's gonna be my facing. Mostly none of that will be visible at the very end since we're gonna add the lining completely by hand. So you can very nicely sew around the facing, as at least I think with by hand it's like super easy to get a neat result in the end. So let's put this on and then we can do the tabs right here. I'm gonna cut down the facing to an appropriate size and kind of square it off as well. And now I'm gonna iron the ditch of the seam towards the inside. And I need to cut towards the stitching line here at the tab notch. Otherwise I won't be able to actually iron. So let's go ahead and iron this. Okay. And with that, the placket for the grommets is prepared. You can put some needles in here in order to have everything lay correctly. And now we can go over the tabs. So we're gonna cut away the seam allowance of the tabs sections, so down here at the rounded areas. But before we do that, I just wanna go around every tab and stitch at, let's say, 12 millimeters or 11 millimeters, something like that. Like a little bit more inwards than what you're gonna cut away, which is your seam allowance. So a little bit more for me than 1 centimeter. And I'm gonna use a fairly small stitch just to make sure that the fraying is as minimal as possible. And then we can cut away the seam allowance and actually use bias binding to finish the tabs. Okay, with that done, we can cut away the seam allowance. One very important thing is right here in the front. You want to make sure that you mirror the exact curvature of the other side, which is what I did. I basically just closed it and checked for the curve and just drew it on so that I know where to cut and then also where to sew my bias binding on. So the upper line is my bias binding stitching line, the lower one is my cutting line. So let's start from the back. So if we do something wrong, then it's at least in the back until we are confident enough. And also I am using an old pair of scissors. If you're using your normal scissors with the boning right here, this is just plastic, but your scissors will get dull, obviously, over time. So just use some scissors that you're not currently using anymore for fabrics. Okay, that should be it. As you can see, it already lays so much better because there is no seam allowance in the way now. So let's go ahead and add the bias binding. I'm going to use some cotton bias binding in a similar color, and I'll open both sides basically in the end. Since we're going to add a lining, it doesn't have to look neat on the inside. I'd like to have like a little bit more room basically to attach my lining. That's why I'm going to open the inside. Basically it's going to lay like this in the end on the inside. I guess it's just easier for me, but you can do whatever you want. And I'm going to place it like this so that once I turn it, it gives a nice edge. And one thing you have to be very careful about, since there is a curve, you need to give the inside right here enough fabric in order to go around. Like when you turn it over, it needs more fabric on the outer curve than where you sew. So be very generous with the amount of fabric that you put in. Just avoid any folds. Like you can, since this is on the bias, you can like give it a bit more fabric and not have it wrinkle up, and you're not going to sew any folds in. So do that to the max so that once you fold it over, you're having a nice clean edge. And then up here, it's the exact opposite, but you'll have to play around probably a bit. You have to kind of like go 5 millimeters higher than your end of the, like where the tab notch is. Go 5 millimeters higher, put your needle in your bias binding, and then kind of fold the bias binding like this. And then go over and do that again, so that once you fold it over, it creates like here a kind of folded area, and you have on the inside enough to actually sew it down. So I guess just exercise. I also needed a few attempts, like I exercised on my tryout to like do that because I've never done it before either. And yeah, so that really helped me before you go on to your final piece. And with these techniques, I'm just gonna go around all of the tabs and stop right here with the bias binding folded at that edge right here, so that once we turn it over, it has also a clean finish here. Okay, this looks rather messy now, but we're gonna iron and arrange everything so that it doesn't look messy anymore. First things first, let's flip the binding towards the inside, like so. And I like to just pin it in place, especially like right here in the beginning. I am gonna pin and iron this in place. I mean, it's cotton, so it irons nicely by your fingers already, but still. And let's just pin it here, so that it looks really nice from the right side. And this hopefully mirrors the arch that I have on my other side. So let's work our way up. And I'm gonna work like with the inside facing up because to me it's just more comfortable. I'm gonna fold and pin. And once we reach this part up here, there's a little bit of cutting that we have to do. So let's just fold everything towards the inside. And you can see that this edge is just not long enough to lay flat. So I'm just gonna ease it a bit by cutting somewhere here, and then it already lays nicer. And we're gonna check from the right side obviously in a second as well. This looks already pretty good, I would say. You can use an edge former or something like that to kind of get crisper edges. And once you're satisfied with the look of that, you just iron it in place and continue with the next one. So with all of that prepared, I'm just gonna iron to just flatten it a tiny bit. And then I'm gonna go with also a small stitch at the very edge of my bias binding all around. And then the tabs are done. Okay, that is what it looks like. I think it really nicely worked out. I'm gonna repeat the same thing with the bias binding for the neckline. Then I also have a really clean finish up there. It's also gonna look like that because I'm gonna add the lining afterwards. And the grommets are also ready to be put in once the neckline is finished. So now it's lining time, and you want to cut out the lining, like all the same paper pattern pieces you want to cut out from your lining fabric as well, and put all of the dividing seams together just as we did for the fascia fabric. And then you want to go around the perimeter of the corset and actually sew by hand the lining onto your pieces, obviously also onto the other side. Once you're done with that, you're gonna do the grommets. Now I'm gonna do it a tiny bit differently just for show. Basically, I'm gonna switch the order in lining and grommets and, you know, work around it, even though it's not going to be as pretty on the inside as it would be if you do it correctly. That's why I'm saying that. So do the lining first, add everything by hand onto your piece, and afterwards do your grommets. So the grommets are gonna get put into right here, the grommet placket that we prepared. And for that, I actually wanna have the other side laying next to the center back here so that I can, you know, make them completely the same. So you can see here the placements of the grommets. Basically, I measured 1.5 centimeters from my stitching line down, so 2.5 here since I have the seam allowance still on my piece. And that is the first grommet. And then I just measured 4 centimeters down until here, where I did 2 centimeters distance. And obviously the grommets will be placed in the center of our placket. I also added these big ones for the shoulder straps in the front and the back, where, you know, the kind of round areas are. And then I also added 4 grommets to the first 3 tabs to put in some decorative bands and, you know, have a bow tie here, and also to prevent the tabs from like staying away from your bodice, which I felt like they were doing when I put the one side on. Obviously it wasn't laced up, I didn't have like a skirt underneath or whatever, but I felt like they were kind of like doing this in a way. So I thought maybe if I add some satin band right here and do this cute little detail, it's just gonna look really cute, and it's also gonna prevent that, what I was saying just now. So those are all of the placements. For these grommets down here, I measured 4 centimeters down from the corner right here of my bias tape. So from here I measured 4 centimeters down, and that was the center of my grommet, and then 6 centimeters for the other one, and here the same, 4 centimeters and 6 centimeters down. Okay, all of the placements are drawn in, and now I can use, I'm actually going to use my Vario Creative tool because it is super easy to punch holes with that. And I'll be back once the grommets are in. So for the shoulder strap, I'm actually going to use felt, which I'm gonna double, and then I have my pattern piece, which I'm just gonna put right on top here and sew around into the seam allowance, and then I'll do the bias binding the same way as I bound the edges of my corset. Once that's done, just put some grommets in either end, put a satin band in, and have shoulder pads, which look really, really cute. And that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed this very experimental kind of tutorial project, whatever. I am super, super pleased with how it looks, so I hope you guys like it too. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll get notified every time that I post. I post on Sundays. It would also mean a lot to me if you'd comment down below to boost the algorithm a bit. That would help me out tremendously. In the meantime, if you haven't already, go check out my social media. Links to all of that are in the description below. I'm doing short format content for my projects every week. If you're interested in the pattern, head over to my Etsy store. Link will also be in the description down below, and check out all of my patterns that I have. I have so many, you guys, almost hitting 100, which is super, super exciting. That is the most direct way to support me and keep videos just like this one coming, so thank you so much for that. A special thank you also to my channel members. You can get exclusive benefits through the link in the description down below. So thank you so much for watching, and I'm going to see you next Sunday. Bye, guys! Wow, my microphone really had to run out of battery at the last minute.